So, as I mentioned earlier, we're concluding our series, Address the Mess, this week. And I really want to encourage you to make sure that you're here next week as we start a new series. I know it's Memorial Day weekend, and it's probably going to be nice, and the sun's going to be out, and there's, mountains and beautiful things in Colorado, but be here for this series. It's called Dangerous Prayers, and really, we're going to look at prayer in a fresh and different way. We're not playing it safe, but we're going to invite God to do some incredible things in and through us in this series. So I really want to encourage you to come, not just come yourself, though, invite a friend. The first week of a new series is always a great time to invite someone. So we hope to see you next week. Today, though, for our message, I would like to start with a question. The question is this: have you ever made a mess messier? Have you ever made a mess messier? So I am kind of notorious or, known for making stains worse. You know what I'm talking about? Like you have a hamburger, a big juicy burger, you take a bite and the ketchup falls out of the backside onto your shirt. And it's okay, because I know how to deal with this. You take a napkin and you wipe, right? And what I've learned is that actually spreads the ketchup on the shirt and making a mess. Has anyone else done this? Anyone? It doesn't. Maybe mustard, maybe barbecue sauce. Okay, you're with me. Maybe you were outside or working on the car. You've been there. This is good. I'm not alone. But I have a real problem with this. I'm bad at it. In fact, there was one time when I was much younger where I said, well, I know how to fix this mess. I'm going to use bleach. Unfortunately, it was not a white shirt. So I learned something that day, and I no longer have that shirt. So I have so much trouble with this that I just stopped. I don't deal with stains anymore. I have a new solution. I hold out the shirt. I go, honey, and magically the stain disappears. You should try it. You really should. Not with my wife, though. No. Anyways, now that's one kind of mess. But what about when you make a financial mess messier? What about when you make a marriage mess messier? You make a morality mess messier. You make a professional mess messier, or an academic mess messier. I mean, it goes on and on. And so today, we're going to talk about the reason it makes a mess messier. In fact, if you're not a church person, you're not someone who's religious, this, I believe, applies to you as well. This is really, I think, a universal truth. And it's this, that every mess that you make and every mess that you're involved in, whether it's a mess you created, whether it's a mess that you married into, a mess that you inherited, every mess comes with some bad options. Borrow more, right? Lie bigger. Destroy the evidence. Maybe make up a story. Or send another text message that makes it sound like the first text message wasn't really intended for that person. There's always some really bad options that come with a mess. And these options essentially make the mess messier. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about because I want to save you from You see, some of the messes, they're unavoidable, right? And if you're in the middle of a mess, there's no way to go back and unmake the mess. But the mess within it that you're currently facing, there are some really bad options. And you're being tempted, like all of us, to opt for something that will make your mess messier. To talk about avoiding making your mess messier today, I want to tell you a story, and it's from the Old Testament. It's in the book of 1 Samuel, and this takes place about 1000 BC, and it's about King David before he becomes king. And it all begins where, David's a boy, and seemingly out of nowhere, the prophet Samuel shows up at his house and anoints David king. Like, this is exciting. This is monumental. This is a young shepherd boy. This is life-changing for him. He's anointed king. But there's a problem. Israel already has a king. And so now Israel has two kings. They've got this adult king, Saul, and this shepherd boy, David, who did not assume the throne, but instead continued tending his sheep. And as time went on, David became very popular in Israel. As you may know, he went and visited his brothers while they were serving in the army, and he was there and he saw Goliath in the valley, off in the distance, and he thought to himself, well, I've killed a bear, I've killed a lion, I don't see how this is any different. So David kills this giant of a man, Goliath, that the entire army was terrified to face. And as you can imagine, his star rose throughout Israel. Everyone knew about David. I mean, the entire army saw his bravery as he did the very thing that none of them were willing to do. And so everyone's talking about David. He's the buzz all around Israel. And this is really just the beginning. Samuel writes in 1 Samuel chapter 18, we're going to spend a little time there, and then we'll move into chapter 24. But in 1 Samuel 18, verse 14, he writes, in everything he did, he had great success. And when Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And so, as a result, all the people saw David, and they saw all these great things that he's doing. And so, naturally, the question that they started asking was, is David our next king? And so, Saul realizes that he has a problem. And so, he's got to find a way to control David. And so, he gets an idea. And this idea is, if I offer David one of my daughters in marriage, then I'll be able to control him. So he makes this offer to David, and David's response is just so good. It's so good. He says, "Oh, King Saul, what an honor. I am just a lowly shepherd boy, and my family is not a very important family. I am not worthy of the honor to marry one of your daughters." And so the word spreads all throughout Israel about David and his humility. Then they're talking like, oh, man, he had a chance to become a part of the king's family. Oh, David, he's so humble. And this is the buzz all throughout Israel. And so things continue in this direction, and David's popularity continues to grow. But in the meantime, Saul's jealousy also grows. And then one of Saul's daughters falls in love with David. Yes! Saul is he's chomping at the bit here. He goes, this is it. This is my chance. I'm going to do it again. And so he approaches David, and this time it's different because David is interested. And so David says yes. And Saul, his response is remarkable. He says, the bride price for my daughter is not money. The bride price for my daughter, it's not sheep or oxen or goats or herds. No, the bride price for my daughter is 100 dead Philistines. If you want to marry my daughter, bring me 100 dead Philistines. I mean, this is perfect. He says, Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do it. I mean, what a brilliant plan as he's trying to get David out of the way, because there's no way that David and his band of merry men can pull this off. Can't be done. True to form, David goes out and he kills not 100 Philistines, but 200 Philistines. And this just makes things worse for Saul, as we read in verse 28, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, meaning that he couldn't manipulate his daughter to control David. Saul became more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. So, here's the connection between all of this and address the mess. David has a huge mess on his hands. And what's really unique about David's mess, what makes it different from us is, sometimes I make a mess or you make a mess. David did not make this mess. He didn't ask to be king. David killed Goliath out of duty to his country, to serve his country. David, he said no to the king's daughter's hand in marriage. And it didn't seem to matter what David did, but things just got worse and worse and messier and messier. So one afternoon, Saul loses it, and he tries to kill David in the palace. And so David runs for his life out into the desert. And from that point on, Saul had it out for David. He wanted to kill him. He was jealous. And he wanted his son Jonathan to be the next king. And so as long as David was alive, he realized that he was a threat to him as the king and to the dynasty that he was setting out to establish. So here's where things get really interesting. As we go to chapter 24 in 1 Samuel, verse 1, it says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So, Saul's been out fighting the Philistines. They're bloody, they're tired, they're ready to go home. They've lost friends along the way. And somebody approaches King Saul and says, we've got him. And so Saul, he took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats, which is this large spring that looked something like what you're going to see here in a moment. It's just, it's rocks and hills, this desert of En-Gedi, mountains and caves and some shrub grass, and every once in a while, you'll find a spring. And so David and his men are at this spring. And Saul knows this, and he's decided that this is my chance to take care of David once and for all. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. So, side note here, just in case you're wondering, this is one of the few points in the Bible where it talks about going to the bathroom. I'm not sure that has any value for you. I just want to point it out. You're all thinking it anyways. So this is one of those few places. But here's the situation. Saul and his men, they're going along, and Saul needs a potty break. Right? So 3,000 men all stop and wait so Saul can go potty. And so he climbs up this hill, he gets into a cave, and he does his thing. And this is kind of the situation here. It's interesting because David was in the area, and he was alerted to what was going on, that King Saul is coming. So he said to his men, we're going to go hide in the caves, and we're going to let Saul pass through, and once he's gone, we're going to go out and go the other way. So the very cave that Saul is going into, David is in that cave with his men. What are the odds of this, right? If ever God had ordained something, this is it. If ever God had done a miracle for David, this is that miracle. In fact, David's men, they all saw this as God having delivered him into David's hands. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. This is it. They saw this as that very opportunity where Saul's men see him walk into the cave. And a few moments later, David comes out with Saul's severed head and takes his rightful place as king. So David, he gets caught up in the emotion of all this, wouldn't you? And so, he's ready to do this. He's been an outlaw. He's been on the run. He's been a fugitive. And now his enemy is in the most vulnerable position possible. And he decides that I'm going to do unto him as he intends to do unto me. So let's just pause the story right here because I think this is important as we look at our own messes. At the root of most messes is a breakdown in virtue. At the root of most messes, whether it's a mess that you married into, a mess you inherited, a mess that your predecessor created, at the root of most all of those messes is some sort of breakdown in virtue. And virtue is integrity. Virtue is honesty. Virtue is self-control and goodness. And so when you take a closer look at these messes, when you look at the cause of all of these messes, there's very often some sort of breakdown in virtue. In other words, if you ignore virtue, eventually you will make a mess. If you ignore virtue, it's just a matter of time. It's cause and effect. You will make a mess. If you ignore virtue in your marriage, if you ignore virtue in your finances, if you ignore virtue in your friendships or your profession or your education, it's just a matter of time. But you will make a mess. And you don't clean up a failure in virtue with another failure in virtue. You don't clean a flood with more water. You don't clean a ketchup stain with more ketchup. Two wrongs don't make a right, and two messes don't make an unmess. You can't clean up a failure of virtue with another failure of virtue. And these bad options that every mess comes with, these bad options always come with a failure of virtue. We're always tempted by these options because they look like a quick fix. I can make this better. I can fix it. I can turn this around. Everything will work out just fine if I just borrow a little more money. If I just tell this little lie, if I cover the evidence, if I get a friend to say that I was somewhere that I wasn't, so that no one knows where I actually was. And these are so tempting. But you don't clean up a mess that started with a failure in virtue by adding to it another failure in virtue. And this is exactly what David was about to do. Samuel tells us that David, he crept up unnoticed. See, David was a soldier. David was a fighter, and so he could just sneak up right behind Saul, grab him by the head, slit his throat, and that is the last breath that Saul would ever make. Ew, yes. And so David's about to do this ew thing. And it occurs to him, I'm about to make my mess messier. I'm about to assassinate my king. I'm about to kill my wife's father, my kid's grandpa. What am I thinking? If I do this, if I murder this king, this will be my story forever. And here's the trap in this. Would it be justified? Yes. Would it be expected? Everyone thought he would do this. Yes. Is it the virtuous thing to do? No. In fact, he was going to add part of his story that he would be ashamed of for the rest of his life. Oh, Grandpa, tell us again, how did you become king? Well, your great-grandpa was doing his business one day, and he didn't see it coming, but I slit his throat and took my rightful place as king. So, David, what happened to my father? Well, he was in a cave. They found his throat slit. We're not really sure exactly what happened there. Yeah. See, David was about to make a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. A decision that would color his entire story. It was justified, it was expected, and it was the wrong thing to do. And that's our tension. That's the problem that we all face, because every mess comes with some really bad options. And then David, he crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Can you imagine David's men as they're watching him sneak up behind Saul, and he just cuts off a little piece of his robe and heads back. It says afterwards that David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hands on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." It's as if all of a sudden he realized, hey guys, God put Saul in place, and I have no business replacing what God has put into place. I have no business replacing what God has put into place, and I do not want to become king by killing my king. So as he realizes this, his men respond, they're saying, hey, you may not want his blood on your hands, we get that, but we are more than happy to get his blood on our hands. We would love nothing more. We're willing to do what you are unwilling to do. It says, with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and he went on his way. So Saul reappears from the cave, and he goes and he joins his men, and after a moment, just before they're about to leave, David pops out, "Yoo-hoo!" And everyone in that moment knows exactly what just didn't happen. David says, "This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. Not only did I not kill you, but I delivered you from other men. I kept people at bay who wanted to kill you. I will not lay my hand on the Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed." You may not look like the Lord's anointed. You may not be a good example of the Lord's anointed. You may not be behaving like the Lord's anointed, but nonetheless, you are the Lord's anointed. And I am not going to replace what God has put into place. He continues, he says, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As you can imagine here, David's reputation throughout the community gets even higher as they see his grace and his mercy towards King Saul. I mean, essentially what David says is, I'm choosing virtue over hurt you. I'm doing something that no one would ever do. I'm doing something unheard of. I'm taking the high road in such a way that no one else would take. And Saul's response is very simple. He says to David, you're a better man than me. And he turns and he heads back to Jerusalem. And then 7 chapters later, we read that a random Philistine arrow pierces his armor, and David assumes the throne. Every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options. Every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options, and if you choose one of these options, you will make the mess messier. And so here's something that's so important to grab a hold of today. This is a major, major takeaway. Your response to the mess is the real story. The real story isn't the mess. You can't go back and change what's happened. You can't unsay what's already been said. You can't undo what's already been done. The real story is your response to the mess. And your response to the mess becomes the permanent part of the story. Your response to the mess, not just the mess itself, but your response to the mess becomes a permanent part of the story. And I would argue that it is the defining part of the story. Which leads us to 2 questions. 2 questions that I'm begging you to ask. Somehow, in the midst of everything that's happening and the emotion that he's feeling, David asks the first of these 2 questions, which is, what story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? So when people ask you, David, how did you become king? What story do I want to tell? When people discover that 3 years ago you were in the midst of bankruptcy, what story do you want to tell? When they hear that 4 years ago you went through a really tough divorce, or maybe you're going through that right now, what story do you want to tell? Maybe you've dropped out of school. Maybe you failed out of school. What story do you want to tell in how you responded to that situation? The second question is this: which of my options do I want as a permanent part of my story? And I can answer that for you. It's the virtuous one. I faced the situation head on, and I told the truth. I turned myself in. We sat down together and cut up our credit cards. I told my spouse what I was feeling, and we worked through our issues. See, the reality is that all of us have a mess. But the important thing, the thing that might separate you from someone else, the thing that will keep us from making our mess messier is our response to the mess. Students. We had students? Any students in the house? I see a couple of you. Okay. Yeah. Woo! All right, students. Listen to me for just a moment. Do not use your parents' bad behavior as an excuse to behave badly. Don't do it. I know that many of you are in difficult situations in your home right now. And your parents aren't demonstrating this. They're not living this out. In fact, it seems like they're making messes messier at every turn. Do not let your parents' bad behavior be an excuse for you to behave badly. It's all too easy to follow suit in those situations. Well, my parents lie to each other, so I'm just going to lie to them. My parents smoke weed, so I'm just going to smoke weed. Why not? My parents make bad choices, so why can't I just make a few bad choices as well? Don't use your parents' bad behavior as an excuse to behave badly. That is not the story that you want to tell. Instead, how about you think about the opportunity for the story that you have to tell? I did the thing that no one else would do. I opted for virtue over expediency. I trusted my heavenly Father to clean up the mess. Maybe you're here today and you're not a Christian. And we are glad that you're here. We love that you're here. This place is for you. And I hope that maybe hearing this would be one of the things that would help you choose to follow Jesus. But if you are a Christian, this is why Jesus says, follow me. Follow me and I will lead you out. We're going to dodge some really messy messes that your friends would probably have led you right into. We're going to go left when everyone else says that you should go right. And we are going to avoid making the mess messier. And one day, when you talk about your mess, you won't have to lie. You won't be a hypocrite. You won't have to use someone else's bad behavior as an excuse for why you behaved badly. Jesus says, follow me, and I will turn your mess into a message. I will turn your tragedy into triumph. That I'll take the bad and I'll make it good. That I'll take your pain and I will make it your joy, because that is what I do. That I make beautiful things from ugly things. I make miracles from messes. That's what Jesus offers us. And if you're in the middle of a mess today, I recognize that this is an incredibly hard thing to do. It's really easy to come up on stage and talk about it, but it's really hard to live it out. And I realize that your natural instinct is to dismiss the things that I'm saying here today, that to carry on with the mess. You might be rationalizing, well, this won't work for me. Or I couldn't possibly do that. It's too late. We're too far down this road. God couldn't possibly work that way in his life or in her life. And I need to challenge you on that. I recognize that I'm not in your mess. I am not in your story. I'm not intimately aware of every detail of life that you're experiencing, all the things that you're going through, the pain, the emotions. I don't claim to really know about all that. But here's what I do know. And I remind myself of this every day because I need to be reminded of it every single day. And it's that you will never earn God's blessing by violating his principles. You'll never, ever earn God's blessing by violating his principles. It might work out for a season. It might feel good in the moment. You might be able to rationalize that God led you this direction. You might convince yourself that this is God at work. But you never earn God's blessing by violating his principles. And when you look at the whole picture, you know, when you kind of stand to the side and review your life in retrospect, when you look at things through God's eyes and through the lens of his word, which exists as a guide for you, it's a light unto your path that begins to come into focus. And you will see, oh so clearly, that you will never earn God's blessing by violating his principles. So the question remains, what story do I want to tell? And which of my options do I want as a permanent part of my story? Would you pray with me? Jesus, we recognize that life is a mess. Some of us have created the mess. Some of us have inherited the mess. Some of us find ourselves in this mess and don't even know how we got here. But life is a mess. And I pray, Lord, that you would lead us, that you would guide us towards the virtuous option, towards the option that pleases you, the option that would go well for us because we know that you love us and that you have our best interests at heart. And so, God, I pray for every person in this room, every person that hears this message, every person that is a part of this community, a part of this church family. God, I pray that you would grant us clarity in the middle of our messes, that you would show us your way, and that you would give us courage. Courage to do the hard thing. Courage to do the right thing. Courage to do the virtuous thing. And that we would in turn have a beautiful story to tell. God, we love you and we trust you. Would we live our lives in such a way that shows our trust in you? Amen.